Yeah, well, thank you for organizing this workshop and for the invitation to present. So my name is José Marquez. I work yesterday. I started working at the University of Manchester, and I spent the last year at Cambridge. That's why I think in the program you will only find my Cambridge email address, but here you can see my Manchester email address. So yeah, I just started a new job yesterday, and it's been a crazy week. And yes, I have to say that I'm exhausted. So, and I actually finished putting these slides together this morning. So I apologize in advance if there is any typo or any error here. But anyway, you're gonna learn some interesting things today about well-being in schools and research on students' well-being. So my research is mainly about yes, adolescents and young people's well-being, especially in the context of education, and if and how we can promote well-being in schools. And in this presentation, so it's not going to be about one particular study. So we are going to go. I'm going to talk about my research, or through my research, and talk very briefly about some different studies that I have been working on in this particular area. So it's more about a particular area of research than about a specific study. And I will try to highlight the relevance of all this in terms of in the area of time use research, why we should care more about well-being and well-being outcomes. So first I will define well-being, what we understand as well-being. And then I will guide you through some studies that I have worked on as a PhD student and my postdoctoral research and so on. And I will finish with some conclusions and recommendations for future research. So well-being has mainly been defined in terms of including two main aspects. So on the one hand, subjective well-being, and on the other one, eudaimonic or psychological well-being. So eudaimonic or psychological well-being is mainly defined in terms of self-actualization and having a meaningful purpose in life. And hedonic subjective well-being is more about happiness and satisfaction. Okay. Within this second domain, we have on the one hand, well, this is about two things mainly. So first, an affective component. So this is about experiencing positive and negative effects, moods and feelings. And then the second component is basically about life satisfaction. Okay. And I highlighted this in blue because most of the research that I'm going to be talking about today is about this particular outcome, life satisfaction. And in terms of life satisfaction, we have usually we conceptualize this in terms of overall life satisfaction or satisfaction with life as a whole. But then we also focus on domain satisfaction, so satisfaction with your health, with your school or job or whatever. So this is what well-being is about and how we studied how is it conceptualized in research and in policy. So you see these two words here, for example, hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. So these two words come from the ancient Greece because, well, there's been an interest in well-being and it has been studied since more than 2,000 years ago. And also, interest in well-being in the policy arena is not a recent phenomenon either. So, for example, in the 18th century, Jeremy Bentham already argued that the business of government is to promote the happiness of the society. But it is true that most of the interest in this area has taken place in the last 50 years or so. But also, it is also true that most of this interest has to do with adults' well-being. So interest in children's well-being has received much less attention until very recently. But there are some good reasons why we should care more about children's well-being, and the first one is that, well, it's linked to negative outcomes. So experiencing poor well-being is associated with poorer mental health later on and poor academic achievement and so on. There are, of course, some normative reasons here. Well, we should stop considering or focus more about well-being than about well-becoming issues. Stop considering children as future adults. Adults also start caring about their current well-being. There are, of course, also some legal reasons. So, for example, the Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, that basically states that we have a legal obligation to listen to children and hear the views in all the aspects affecting their lives, including policy making. And there are some good academic reasons as well, because, well, there are still some good research questions that remain unexplored and a lot of research to do in this area. So with all this, I became interested in children's well-being, first as a master's student, and then I decided to study this as in my PhD research. And some good news is that there is increasing data availability to study children's well-being. Okay, so for example, by the time I started my PhD, data from PISA 2015 became available. So I decided to take advantage of this and study in my PhD research. This question: can schools and education policy make our children happier? So the focus is on the life satisfaction of 15-year-old students. I use these different research methods, and the focus is, so this is quantitative research, and the focus was on studying country differences. So I focus on 33 countries, and also looking at differences across gender and socioeconomic status. And so this research resulted in these 3 academic papers. And yes, in terms of the research findings, very briefly, the main finding as well, it seems that there is an association between multiple policy relevant factors and students' well-being. And for example, there are some universal correlates that are observed in all the countries studied. So bullying, school anxiety, and feeling supported by parents in relation to school seem to be 3 universal factors explaining variations in students' subjective well-being. But there are also some, not in other countries, but in some countries there's a long list of factors that explain variations in an adolescent's well-being. And some of them include some time use variables. So for example, I found that having breakfast before going to school, doing vigorous exercise outside of school, and talking to parents before and or after school are factors associated with students and adolescents' well-being and life satisfaction. And some of these issues, I think, are relevant to some of the themes and the issues that some of you, Joanna and Sarah, have discussed previously in your presentations, and probably yesterday. The second main finding of my PhD research, is that, well, this is a complex association, as it seems that these relationships differ across countries, schools, and types of schools, gender, and socioeconomic status. So what this means is that although there seems to be some findings that apply universally, so correlates like bullying and so on, that are universally observed, in many cases, what is observed in one particular country or in one particular setting for one particular group of students, let's say boys or girls, might not necessarily be observed in a different context. Okay. So I finished my PhD, and then data from PISA 2018 became available. So I decided to study changes I basically decided to study whether there had been a decline in adolescents' life satisfaction between 2015 and 2018. So whether younger generations of 15-year-old adolescents are reporting lower levels of life satisfaction, mainly because there is an increasing body of research reporting a deterioration in both well-being and mental health in children and young people, well, mainly in adolescents and young people over the last 15 years or so. And I also wanted to look at the factors that may be driving these negative trends. So again, I used data from PISA 2015 and 2018 from 46 countries, some quantitative research methods. This resulted in these 2 papers. And these are the findings. Well, here you can see the table with the deterioration in life satisfaction between 2015 and 2018 for all the countries. But I'm going to move to the next slide because probably you cannot see this very well. And I will focus on the main findings and also in the relevance in terms of time use research. So this first postdoctoral project, the main research findings, first, well, there was a global decline in adolescents' well-being between 2015 and 2018. This was observed in 39 out of 46 countries. There were some differences because I focus on both mean levels of life satisfaction and the proportion of students reporting low life satisfaction, which was defined as those reporting 5 or less in the 0 to 10 life satisfaction scale. And this basically means that in some countries, this deterioration may affect those who were already, or those who are more vulnerable. So the proportion of those vulnerable, no, miserable, and unhappier, the proportion of those more unhappier. Whereas in other countries, this decline was more homogeneously distributed in this life satisfaction scale. So there were some country differences that are interesting. The largest declines were observed in the 4 UK nations, but also in the United States, Japan, France, and Ireland. So mainly Anglo-Saxon countries, but also countries like France and Japan. And again, some interesting group differences. So the decline in life satisfaction mainly affected, in most countries, mainly affected girls, students without an immigrant background, and those of higher socioeconomic status. And also in a few countries, the decline was greater in more rural or urban communities, depending on the country. Now, the second part, or the second paper, focus on factors that might be explaining these negative trends. I focus on 3 domains that have previously been identified as domains that might be driving this deterioration in well-being and mental health. So school well-being, material well-being, and ICT use, so information and communication technologies use. Of course, there were some other factors that I would have liked to look at, but these were simply not available in PISA. Okay. Some of the main findings is that, well, this decline seemed to be, and I focus in this worst, the countries where the life satisfaction declined the most in this period of time. And it seems that the decline was mainly due to a deterioration in school well-being, which was mainly a sense of belonging at the school and feeling lonely at the school and things like that, but also bullying and feeling supported by parents in relation to school. So this was the main finding in all these countries, but interestingly, not in Japan. And what this is interesting, it seems that what is driving this deterioration in life satisfaction in Japan is different from what is driving this deterioration in Western countries. The Western and Eastern divide is common in well-being research, but yes, this is interesting, and more research is needed here to see what might explain this decline in Japan. And relevant to time use research, there were some interesting gender differences. And for example, something interesting that I found is that affects playing video games. So younger generations of children spend more times now playing video games and online games, and this involves both girls and boys. So both girls and boys are spending now more time on video games, but it seems that this is detrimental to the life satisfaction of girls only. So those who increase the time, or well, part of this decline was explained by more time on video games, but this only applied for girls. For boys, there will not impact on this. I think this is interesting, and it deserves our attention in the future. Why this might be the case, and this might be the case in countries that are very different, like Japan, France, or Ireland. In my postdoctoral research, I also was invited to collaborate in this study, reporting on a positive psychology intervention in a private school in Dubai. And so I contributed to this paper in 2 ways. First, I studied changes in students' daily habits during the COVID-19 pandemic, during the lockdowns, to study how this has changed. And well, it's a bit obvious that they spent less time during the lockdown engaging in physical activity. They spend more time sleeping, more time on social media, and more time playing video games. And the second part involved looking at how these changes in daily habits might have affected well-being. And very much related to what Joan talked about in his presentation, the main effect that I found is that large positive effects for sleeping more. So those who increase their time sleeping at night during the lockdown experience a substantial increase in their well-being in different domains, not only in life satisfaction, but in some of the other domains that I talked about. While changes were not substantial for these other changes in daily habits. And well, as Joan explained before, this is very much aligned with previous research in this area, that more sleep is associated with better well-being and mental health outcomes in children and young people, and also with research suggesting or indicating that delaying school start time would be better for the well-being and academic outcomes of children and young people. Well, now I'm gonna go very quickly through this because we are running out of time, but I'm involved in some other research. So I've been working on this study across longitudinal analysis to determine the direction of the effects between life satisfaction and mental health. So we know that they are not the same, but they are related. We know that we are not sure about which one predict each other, and we don't know much about this in the context of adolescence and in some key developmental transitions, for example, between middle adolescence to emerging adulthood. So yeah, I conducted this study. I found reciprocal associations, so we do know that life satisfaction in adolescence predicts mental health in emerging adulthood. This is something that speaks clearly about the necessity to pay more attention to life satisfaction in adolescence because it can predict very important outcomes like mental health later in life. And we know that life satisfaction in adolescence is can be predicted by some time use, some important time use variables. So how children spend and adolescents spend their time in adolescence impacts life satisfaction, and this ultimately will impact also mental health in this way. Well, there are some other research that I'm involved at the moment, but not very relevant. And now I started my this new job at the University of Manchester. I'm gonna be working in this Be Well project. This is a very interesting project. So Greater Manchester is the one of the largest metropolitan areas in Europe. I think 3 million people or so. So for 3 years, we're going to be collecting data on the well-being and mental health of secondary school students in these 3 domains that you see here, and to study also drivers in these 6 different areas. So this is more than 200, well, it's 10 local authorities within Greater Manchester, more than about 200 schools, dozens of thousands of students over 3 years. And the idea is not only to analyze this data and produce some research findings and so on. The idea is to work closely with schools, with local authorities, and with organizations at the community level to identify specific responses, because we know from research on well-being that although there are some universal factors explaining variations in well-being, most of the variation in adolescence well-being is explained by the closest environment of the child, so things that happen at home, at the school, and in the community. And this might differ hugely even within a metropolitan area. So we are sure that we will find differences within Greater Manchester in terms of some groups that might be more vulnerable in some areas than in others, and some drivers that might be more important in some areas than in others. Last slide, I believe. So a summary of what I talked about in this presentation, or about these different studies. Well, there is an association between multiple policy relevant factors and students' well-being, including many time use variables. But this association is complex. It differs across countries, schools, types of schools, gender, and socioeconomic status. There's been a decline in adolescent subjective well-being, and this has been, and also mental health. This has been reported in a large number of studies. We should be concerned about this, and we should care more about well-being and mental health. As to this decline, well, there is again some differences across countries and gender, socioeconomic status, and some other groups. In view of my research, this might be mainly due to deterioration in school well-being, but not everywhere. So this is not the case for Japan, which is interesting. And this decline, there are some interesting findings in terms of time use. Okay, so and I give you this particular example of video gaming, with increased time in playing video games being negatively associated with life satisfaction among girls, but not among boys. Life satisfaction in adolescence can predict later mental health, and we know that life satisfaction can be predicted by time use, and this is important. And again, and this is related to some of the research that Joe and Sarah and some other researchers presented today and yesterday. Well, there were some changes with the lockdown, but there's this finding that sleeping more at night is associated with better well-being outcomes. So it's right now 20 minutes. I'm gonna leave it here. I'm gonna skip this future research slide, and we're happy to take some questions.